The stars above burned cold, indifferent. On the edge of a forgotten moon, far from trade routes or rescue signals, the universe held its breath and no one noticed. No one, except a single human. Julian Cross wasn't a hero. He never claimed to be. He'd spent years running from the wreckage of war, numbing himself with silence and distance. His ship, barely held together with salvaged parts and stubbornness, was meant to be his escape from everything, especially the screams he couldn't save in the past. But then, he heard one more. A voice, thin, cracked, barely more than a whisper, filtered through a broken transmission buried in static. Most wouldn't have caught it. Fewer still would have cared. But something about that voice. It didn't plead. It didn't beg. It simply existed, hanging in the dark like the last breath of someone who had already accepted they were going to die. He could have ignored it. Should have. But he didn't. When Julian found her, chained inside a shattered cargo container, his first thought wasn't fear. It was anger. Not at her but at the world that let this happen. She wasn't just imprisoned. She was discarded, forgotten. Her skin shimmered in unnatural hues, glowing faintly where bruises hadn't yet faded. And when she looked at him, her golden eyes didn't ask for help. They asked why it had taken so long for anyone to come. Julian didn't have answers. What he had was a decision. He didn't see a mission. He saw a girl who should have been dead, still fighting to breathe. And in that moment, in the silence between stars, one human made a choice that would rewrite the future. He reached for her chains and the universe began to change. Beneath a fractured sky on a forgotten moon, silence had become law. There were no more voices, no more prayers, no more resistance. Just the hum of abandoned machinery and the soundless ache of things that once had meaning. This was where old wars left their scars. Where civilizations buried their shame. A place no longer worthy of maps or memory. The moon had no name anymore, just debris, cold wind, and ash. It was here, in the rust and the dust, that she cried out. Not loudly. Not desperately. Just a breath, a small voice that barely registered above the static of a dying world. It wasn't a scream for help. It was quieter than that. Quieter, and heavier. Like someone who had already screamed 1,000 times and learned no one would come. Her voice didn't call out with hope. It called out with surrender. And yet, someone heard it. Julian Cross didn't mean to hear anything that day. He wasn't listening. His ship schemed the atmosphere on the way to nowhere, chasing the kind of silence that a man seeks when he's tired of pretending to care. He wasn't running from something. He was just drifting past it. A man without a cause, a plan, or anyone left to disappoint. But the universe has a way of reaching into you when you least expect it. It finds the cracks. It speaks into the places you thought you'd sealed shut. That's what happened when the signal came through, brief, garbled, like a whisper through broken glass. It wasn't on any frequency worth tuning into. Just noise. But Julian stopped breathing when he heard it. Not because of what it said, but because of how it sounded. A voice that didn't expect to be answered. A voice that had long given up, and yet spoke anyway. He tried to shake it. Pilots like him learned to shut out ghosts. But it stayed with him. He rerouted. Not because it made sense. Because it didn't. He followed the signal to a crumbling industrial yard, half buried under the wreckage of collapsed towers and half-forgotten war machines. The air tasted like metal and regret. The silence was thick. But he kept walking, his boots crunching through a graveyard of forgotten progress. Then, finally, he found her. She was not what he expected. Not a soldier. Not a survivor with fire in her eyes. Just a girl young, thin, and bound inside a cage that hadn't been built to hold something living for long. Her skin shimmered in shades that shouldn't have belonged to any species he knew, bruised in places where shackles had bitten too deep. Her clothes were tattered, barely more than remnants. And her eyes, those eyes golden, wide, and still burning with the last embers of a soul that hadn't fully gone out. She looked at him like a question. Not who are you, but why now? He didn't speak right away. What could he say? That he was sorry? That he didn't know she existed until this moment? That she mattered now but hadn't a few hours ago? Instead, he stepped forward, hands visible, voice low. I'm not here to hurt you. Her body flinched instinctively. Pain had taught her not to believe words. But something in his tone, steady, quiet, human, cut through the instinct. She didn't relax. But she didn't recoil either. He crouched, eyes locked on hers. Can you tell me your name? Her voice cracked as she spoke. Illyra. He nodded. A name gave her shape. Gave her meaning. Not a prisoner. Not a thing. Illyra. Who did this to you? He asked. She hesitated, then whispered, they said I wasn't worth selling. That sentence landed in his chest like a blade. Not worth selling. Not even worth the cruelty of profit. Just tossed aside like trash because she was too broken to trade. Julian exhaled slowly, anger simmering behind his calm. He looked at the chains. Heavy. Reinforced. Cruel. He wrapped his fingers around one of them. You're going to feel lighter in a second, he said. She didn't understand until the metal snapped. Her breath caught. No one breaks reinforced shackles with bare hands, she said softly, disbelief cracking through her voice. He shrugged. Guess they shouldn't have used cheap alloys. But her gaze didn't leave him. Not just because he was strong. But because he had come. Because he had chosen to see her. That's when the shift happened, not in her body, but in her spirit. She had spent so long believing no one would come, that her voice had no weight, that her existence was disposable. But this human had turned around. He had heard the cry that wasn't meant to be heard. He had walked through wreckage and ruin for no reward, no mission, no praise. Just because she was still breathing. And he answered. He helped her stand, though her legs trembled. He wrapped his jacket around her without comment. He didn't ask for her gratitude. He didn't ask for her past. He just asked, can you walk? She tried. Failed. But when she stumbled, he caught her not like someone lifting a burden, but like someone catching something precious. Gently. Quietly. Without judgment. On the way back to his ship, she whispered something. Why did you come for me? Julian didn't stop walking. But his voice was soft when he answered. Because someone had to. There was no grand prophecy. No special orders. No prophecy driving him forward. Just the simple, quiet weight of conscience. And in that answer, Illyra found something she'd never had before. Not safety. Not freedom. But the first ember of something far more dangerous. Hope. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing in the universe isn't a weapon. It's a voice that refuses to stay silent. A choice to care when no one else will. A dying moon. A fading signal. And one human who chose to listen. He was never meant to be anyone's savior. Julian Cross didn't wear medals. He didn't carry a badge or a code. There were no grand speeches carved into his past, no promises made under starlight, no vows to protect the innocent. He was a man who had learned, the hard way, that believing in something often left you broken and alone. The galaxy had taught him that the ones who cared too much were the first to fall, and the ones who walked away were the only ones who survived. So he walked away from wars, from comrades, from the idea of meaning. He became a pilot without a cause, drifting from system to system, ferrying supplies and shadows, avoiding conflict, avoiding people, avoiding anything that might dig too deep. He wasn't trying to forget. He was just trying not to feel. Some called him cold. Some called him efficient. But those who knew even a sliver of his story called him something else entirely. Haunted. Julian didn't plan to be near the decaying mining outpost where she was held. It was a navigational detour, a mistake his ship's aging systems made while rerouting through uncharted space. He should have corrected course and moved on. But something in the static he intercepted, raw, garbled, laced with pain, held him in place. It wasn't a distress signal. No official beacon. Just fragments of a voice, fragile and distant, as though the speaker no longer believed anyone was listening. That was the part that stayed with him. That was the part that broke through all the numbness he'd wrapped around his heart. He told himself he was only checking it out. That if it was a trap, he'd walk away. If it was nothing, he'd forget it. But when he reached the ruins and found the remains of an old slave transport yard, overgrown and crumbling under its own shame, he knew this wasn't nothing. It was something and someone. He found her inside what once had been a storage bay, now nothing more than rust and silence. A cage sat in the center of the room like an accusation. Inside it, she barely moved. Small. Shackled. Eyes half closed. Her skin bore colors he'd never seen, bruised beneath a shifting luminescence that seemed to pulse with every labored breath. She didn't beg him for help. She didn't even flinch. She just looked at him, looked through him, as if trying to decide whether he was real or just another hallucination brought on by pain and starvation. He remembered standing there, not moving, unsure of what to say. The part of him that had been trained to assess, calculate, detach told him this was not his fight. He could walk away. He had walked away from worse. But something in the way she stared at him, silent, tired, and still unbroken, made it impossible. He stepped closer. She blinked but didn't move. "How long have you been here?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Then, her voice cracked through dry lips. "Does it matter?" It was a fair question. One that clawed at something deep inside him. She'd been here long enough to lose her sense of time. Long enough to stop believing rescue was coming. And still, she hadn't let go. He knelt beside the cage, slowly. "I'm not with them," he said. "I know," she whispered. "They don't speak softly." He could have told her he was sorry. He could have told her he'd make things right. But those were the kinds of promises people made when they needed to feel like heroes. And Julian wasn't interested in pretending. "I don't have a plan," he said. She studied him. "Then why are you here?" He didn't have a good answer. Not one that would make sense. So he gave her the only truth that mattered. "Because you shouldn't still be in this cage." The silence between them was thicker than any metal. He pulled a multi-tool from his belt and reached for the lock. She tensed. Flinched. But didn't stop him. The chains were old but reinforced. Meant to hold something stronger than she looked. He had to pry, bend, and finally snap them using the edge of a power cell he cracked apart. When the last shackle fell to the ground with a lifeless thud, she stared at her wrists like they no longer belonged to her. "You're free," he said. She laughed, a soft, breathless, broken sound. "You say that like it means something." "It should," he replied. She tried to stand, collapsed, and for a moment he saw something raw behind her gold-lit eyes, not fear, not gratitude, but confusion. As if she hadn't imagined what would come after the cage. He caught her before she hit the floor. She didn't weigh much. But she trembled in his arms like someone holding the weight of too many forgotten years. Later, as they soared away in his ship, with her curled in a blanket and barely speaking, he sat in the pilot's seat and asked himself why. Why had he gone back? Why had he taken her? Why had he risked everything? He had no perfect answer. All he knew was this: there are people who turn away and people who don't. Not because they're brave. Not because they're strong. But because they remember what it's like to be abandoned. To be unheard. To be left behind. Julian Cross wasn't a hero. He never would be. But he was the kind of man who couldn't turn his back anymore. And sometimes, that's exactly the kind of person the galaxy needs. She wasn't supposed to survive. When Julian Cross opened the corroded hatch of the forgotten cell buried beneath layers of industrial debris, he didn't expect life. The air was heavy with the stench of rust, old plasma burns, and silence. Not the kind of silence that offered peace, but the kind that screamed of suffering, of absence, of things long neglected and left to rot. He had seen cages before. He had seen what war and power did to those deemed expendable. But this was different. This wasn't a prison for containment. It was a tomb. And yet, in the far corner of the cell, curled against the frozen metal wall, something moved. At first, he thought it was a mistake, a trick of the light, the twitch of a shadow. But then he heard it. Breathing. Shallow. Labored. But steady. Against all logic, someone was still alive. He stepped forward, slowly, cautiously. The figure didn't flinch. Didn't call out. She didn't reach for help. She didn't expect it. Julian understood that look. He had worn it himself once, after the war, when all the noise had ended and all that was left was the waiting, the unbearable stretch of time when you're no longer sure if you're alive or just failing to die. She looked up as he approached, her gaze hazy but alert. Her skin shimmered faintly, marked with a strange, bioluminescent glow that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. There was blood dried along her hairline, and scars, some old, some brutal and fresh, traced her arms and neck. Her clothing was little more than rags, her wrists bruised and raw beneath the weight of metal restraints far too heavy for her frame. Julian expected fear. He expected hatred or suspicion. Instead, he saw something infinitely more jarring: nothing. Her eyes held no light, no expectation, no question. She didn't even bother to ask who he was. As if identity didn't matter anymore. As if she had been stripped not just of freedom but of the belief that anyone could care who she was at all. And yet, she was breathing. That fact alone unsettled him more than the wounds. Because it meant she had chosen, somehow, in her own way, to stay. To remain in this decaying world where everything had told her she was unwanted, unworthy, and alone. He knelt beside her and said the first words that came to him, not planned, not calculated. "Can you hear me?" Her lips moved. Barely. He leaned in, and the sound she made wasn't a cry for help. It wasn't a plea. It was a whisper so fragile it might have shattered under its own weight. "You're not one of them." It wasn't a question. It was a realization, spoken aloud not with hope, but with resignation. She wasn't reacting to rescue. She was bracing for disappointment. "No," he said quietly. "I'm not." She closed her eyes, and for a moment he thought she had passed out. But then she opened them again, slower this time. And he saw it. Just beneath the numbness. A flicker. A spark. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her species. He didn't know why she had been locked away in a place even scavengers had long since abandoned. But he knew that look. That pulse of something waiting, hidden beneath the ash of despair. Not hope. Not yet. But the memory of it. The possibility of its return. He reached for the chains and began to work on the locks. She didn't move. Didn't protest. Didn't assist. She had nothing left to offer. But she watched him. And the longer he stayed, the more that spark grew, not brighter, but steadier. She was trying to understand. To believe. To let herself accept that this was real. When the final shackle fell and she rubbed her wrists for the first time in what must have been weeks or longer, she looked at him again. Really looked. "You're helping me." It was a statement wrapped in confusion, spoken like someone rediscovering a language they'd once known. Julian didn't respond right away. What could he say? That it was the right thing to do? That he couldn't leave her behind? The truth was simpler than that. He didn't help her because he was noble. He helped her because she was still alive, and something about that fact felt sacred. She was a candle that should have gone out but didn't. And the universe doesn't give you many chances to protect a light like that. "You have a name?" he asked. She hesitated, and for a moment he thought she didn't remember. But then, softly, she said, "Elara." It wasn't just a name. It was a declaration. A quiet reclaiming of identity. "Okay, Elara," he said, and extended his hand. "Let's get out of here." She didn't take it right away. But after a beat, after a slow inhale and a tremble that ran from her shoulders to her fingertips, she reached forward. Her hand was cold. But her grip was real. As they walked out of the compound, slow and uneven, Julian kept glancing at her, watching that spark begin to gather strength. She wasn't speaking much, but he could see it, in the way she moved, in the way she started to notice things around her, in the way her eyes flickered every time she realized she was no longer alone. Back aboard his ship, she sat wrapped in a thermal blanket, sipping broth in silence. He didn't push her. He didn't ask for her story. He just stayed close, present, letting her exist without expectation. And in that silence, something began to grow. What he found on that moon wasn't just a prisoner. She was a voice that hadn't yet gone silent. She was a life that had refused to extinguish. She was a spark, trembling, hesitant, nearly invisible, but still there, still burning, waiting for just enough oxygen to ignite into something fierce and unforgettable. And from that moment forward, Julian knew. He hadn't just freed her. He had awakened something the galaxy had tried to erase. And it was only just beginning. She had been caged for so long that the silence had become a second skin. There was no longer a sense of day or night, of before or after. Time had collapsed into a singular, heavy stillness, where each breath was just another reminder that she had not yet been allowed to die. The chains around her wrists and ankles were more than just restraints, they were declarations of worthlessness, hammered in place by people who believed her existence was a mistake. She had stopped crying out a long time ago, not because she had given up hope, but because it no longer made sense to waste hope where none had ever existed. So when Julian Cross broke into her prison, she didn't look up expecting rescue. She didn't flinch or beg. She didn't even ask who he was or what he wanted. She simply stared, eyes dull, waiting for him to walk away like all the others, or worse, become yet another tormentor masked behind a human face. But he didn't walk away. And he didn't make promises. He didn't call her sweetheart or innocent or any of the names they used to pretend they cared. He didn't call her anything at all. He just crouched near the edge of the cage and looked at her, really looked like she was more than her scars, more than the filth on her clothes, more than the bone-deep weariness weighing her down. And when he spoke, his voice was low, rough from disuse, but strangely steady. He asked her name. That was when something shifted. He wasn't asking as if her name was some forgotten piece of a puzzle. He wasn't asking to label her. He was asking because he genuinely wanted to know. As if her identity mattered. As if she mattered. She told him. Quietly. Almost defensively. Illyra. He repeated it back without flinching. As if it were the most natural thing in the world. In that moment, Illyra realized something that startled her more than the sound of his voice or the fact that he hadn't heard her yet. He wasn't trying to save her. And that, oddly, was what made her begin to trust him. Everyone who had ever come into her life with the promise of salvation had brought chains hidden beneath their words. The slavers had promised protection. The captors had offered safety. Even the guards had whispered about freedom in exchange for obedience. But every time, salvation had come with a price: her silence, her submission, her identity. Julian offered none of that. When he broke her chains, he didn't do it with ceremony. There were no dramatic speeches. No declarations of vengeance or justice. He simply said, "You shouldn't be in here." And then he set to work with quiet focus, treating the locks like they were an inconvenience, not a symbol. When the last shackle fell, Illyra didn't thank him. She couldn't. Gratitude had been used against her too many times. She sat there, rubbing her wrists, unsure what to do with freedom that didn't come with a demand. And then he did something that left her even more confused. He stepped back. He didn't lift her out of the cage. He didn't carry her like a child or insist on guiding her movements. He simply waited. "You coming?" he asked, as if the choice were hers. Because it was. That was when she understood. He wasn't there to rescue her. He was there because he believed she could rescue herself. It wasn't that he thought she was strong already. He could see the way her legs trembled, the way she winced with every step. But he didn't treat her like she was broken. He treated her like someone worth standing beside. And for someone who had been locked in darkness for so long, that kind of belief was more powerful than any key. Illyra stumbled as she stepped from the cage, catching herself on the cold wall. She braced for judgment, for some cutting remark about weakness. But Julian said nothing. He didn't offer help unless she asked for it. He just stood nearby, watching, ready but never imposing. The journey back to his ship was slow. She didn't speak. She didn't ask where they were going. All she knew was that she was no longer in the cage, and he wasn't trying to put her in a new one. Later, when they were safely aboard the ship, she sat in silence, wrapped in a blanket he'd handed her. She didn't know what to do with it at first. Warmth felt foreign. Softness felt suspicious. But he didn't hover or insist. He gave her space, and that space, more than anything, was what allowed her to begin breathing again. It was strange to feel seen without being examined. Strange to feel helped without being handled. Strange to feel safe without being controlled. He made her soup. It was overcooked and bland, and she cried after the first bite, not because of the flavor, but because no one had fed her without asking for something in return. He didn't comment on her tears. He didn't say "you're welcome." He just slid the bowl a little closer and said, "Eat as much as you want." Later, she asked him why. Why had he helped her? Why had he come back? Why her? He didn't give a poetic answer. He didn't talk about destiny or redemption or fate. He just shrugged and said, "Because you're still alive. And that means something." It wasn't grand. It was honest. And that honesty became the foundation she began to rebuild herself upon. Elora didn't need a savior. She didn't need another cage made of praise or promises. What she needed was someone who looked at her and didn't see a victim. She needed someone who saw the fire beneath the ash, who understood that broken didn't mean destroyed. She needed someone who could stand beside her, not in front of her. And for the first time in her life, she had that. Not a hero. Just a man who believed she could save herself. The moment the chains fell, the world didn't suddenly get better. There was no applause. No surge of triumphant music. No cathartic moment where everything made sense. When Elora stepped out of the cage, what waited for her wasn't safety. It was uncertainty. Her legs trembled. Her lungs burned with air that felt too sharp. And her heart, once numb, had begun to stir in a way that felt dangerous. Not because it hurt, but because it meant she could feel again. That, more than anything, was terrifying. For so long, her world had been reduced to surviving 1 hour at a time. Hunger. Restraints. The cruelty of guards who needed no reason. The emptiness of days that bled into one another until her name became something she repeated only to remember it hadn't been taken from her yet. But now there were stars. Now there was space outside the walls. A ship that hummed gently instead of growling. A man who didn't demand obedience or beg for praise. A life that wasn't dictated by commands shouted through steel bars. Yet, for all its freedom, the world beyond the cage was overwhelming. She sat in Julian's ship, wrapped in a blanket she hadn't asked for but hadn't refused, and stared out at the vastness stretching beyond the viewport. Black space, scattered with distant suns. So open. So limitless. And in that vastness, she felt a strange kind of dizziness. Because freedom, in its rawest form, was disorienting. There were no boundaries to lean against. No cages to define where she ended and the world began. Julian didn't speak much. He let her be. He fixed the systems. Charted a new course. Made food she sometimes couldn't finish. He never asked what came next. Never pushed. Never assumed she owed him a story, or her loyalty, or anything at all. And somehow, that made her want to speak. She didn't, not yet. But she listened. She listened to the way his voice shifted when he spoke to the ship's AI, low and casual, but with a thread of focus. She noticed the way he moved, deliberate, practiced, like someone used to danger but no longer in love with it. She saw the scar along his jaw, and the way he sometimes stared too long at nothing, as if haunted by something he would never explain. He wasn't a man trying to fix her. He was a man carrying his own wounds. And that, strangely, made him feel safe. Days passed without destination. The galaxy was wide, and they had no map. She thought often about what it meant to be free. People romanticized escape. They made it the climax of stories, the pinnacle of victory. But she knew now that escape was just the breach in the wall. It wasn't the path forward. It wasn't healing. It was the beginning of something far harder. She had to learn how to exist again. Not as property. Not as a secret. Not as a mistake. But as herself, whoever that was now. And it wasn't just about movement or choice. It was about unlearning the fear stitched into her bones. It was about reaching for something without expecting it to be snatched away. About eating food and believing it wasn't laced with threat. About sleeping without expecting someone to drag her back into the dark. Julian understood this, even if he never said so. One night, when she couldn't sleep, she wandered into the cockpit. He was there, leaning back in his seat, boots crossed at the ankles, staring out at the stars as if they owed him something. She didn't say anything at first. Just stood there, unsure if she was allowed. "You ever been out here before?" he asked without turning. She shook her head. "Not like this." He glanced over, eyes soft but unreadable. "It's different when you're not running from something." She sat down across from him. The seat felt too comfortable. Like it belonged to someone else. "I don't know if I'm running or just floating." "That's okay," he said. "Took me years to tell the difference." She looked out the window. "I thought getting out was the end. That once I escaped, everything would fall into place." Julian let out a slow breath. "They don't tell you how much harder it is after." Elora nodded. "No one tells you that the world doesn't wait for you to catch up. That being free doesn't mean knowing who you are." Silence stretched between them. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, like both of them were building something in the space between words. Then Julian said something she didn't expect. "You don't have to figure it all out today." She turned to him, unsure if he meant it. "Freedom isn't a switch," he continued. "It's a slow rebuild. Some days it's flying through stars. Some days it's just breathing." She looked down at her hands. They were no longer bound, but she still held them close to her chest, as if afraid the absence of chains was temporary. "What if I don't know how to be anything but what they made me?" Julian's voice was gentle, but steady. "Then you get to find out who you are. And you get to do it on your terms." She didn't respond right away. But something in her chest began to loosen. Not completely. Not permanently. But enough. Escape hadn't ended her story. It had started a new one with no map, no guarantee, and no audience demanding a tidy conclusion. There would be days when the past roared louder than the stars. Days when she questioned whether she was worth the space she occupied. Days when she felt lost and aimless. But there would also be days, small, quiet, beautiful days, when she looked at the stars and realized they were hers now, too. Freedom wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. A beginning with questions. With fear. With ache. But also with choice. With possibility. With breath. And that was enough. For now. There were things Elora sensed that others never could. Long before the chains. Long before the darkness. Even as a child, she had known when danger approached, even if no one spoke it aloud. She could feel dishonesty in a conversation, the fracture in a smile, the tension behind someone's silence. It wasn't magic. It wasn't visible. It was something deeper, like her mind reached out and grazed the truth beneath other people's words. At first, she thought it was normal. Didn't everyone notice the shadows in a room before the light changed? Didn't everyone feel when a choice was about to go wrong? She mentioned it once to an elder from her village, years before the world unraveled. The woman had gone still, her expression unreadable. That night, Elora was told never to speak of it again. They told her to stay quiet, to be like the others. Blend in. Suppress it? What they didn't tell her, what she learned far too late, was that her gift wasn't a curiosity. It was a threat. Her people, the Saurian, had always been a quiet race. Observers. Artists. Keepers of language and memory. But even among them, Elora was different. There were stories, whispers passed between generations of those who could feel the world too deeply, who could sense what was hidden. They were rare. And feared. Because in a galaxy built on secrets, someone who could feel the truth was more dangerous than any weapon. That was why they came for her. She hadn't done anything. She hadn't harmed anyone. But the moment she was discovered, the bounty followed. Not because of what she had said or done, but because of what she might become. A girl who couldn't be deceived. A mind that couldn't be bent. Someone who could walk into a negotiation and feel who was lying before a single word was spoken. Power like that made governments nervous. So they took her. Erased records. Burned names. Silenced entire villages. Her people vanished from the maps, from the broadcasts, from memory itself. And Elora? She was caged not out of cruelty, but out of fear. The ones who held her didn't scream or sneer. They called it containment. They said it was protection. For whom? They never explained. Years passed. She lost count. But her gift remained, quiet but alive, like a spark buried beneath ash. And then Julian came. She didn't trust him at first. How could she? Every time someone reached out a hand, it came with a price. But something was different. His presence didn't set off the alarms inside her. In fact, for the first time in years, the space around her felt still. Not empty. Balanced. She studied him as they traveled together, watching how his posture shifted depending on the conversation, how his silence spoke as loudly as his words. He never lied to her, not even in small, polite ways. He didn't hide his exhaustion. He didn't mask his uncertainty. He didn't wear a persona to make her feel safe. He was safe, because he didn't pretend to be anything he wasn't. That honesty allowed her to breathe again. As she healed, her ability returned with force. Stronger. Sharper. She could now sense not just lies, but intentions. Emotional rhythms. The subtle shifts of someone wrestling with guilt, anger, fear. She didn't hear thoughts. She didn't control minds. But she could feel the weight others carried, like walking into a room and knowing who had just made a decision they would regret for the rest of their life. At first, she kept it to herself. She had learned the cost of visibility. But when Julian got too close to a traitor on Varith 3 who smiled a little too wide, she felt it, the wrongness under the charm. A twitch of anticipation. The careful modulation of voice. He was planning something. She warned Julian. And she was right. The man had been setting a trap, and Elora had seen it before a single move had been made. That changed everything. Julian started listening in a new way. He didn't question her instincts. He trusted them. Trusted her. And that trust gave her permission to believe in her ability again, not as a burden, but as a part of her. But with power came attention. Whispers traveled faster than light speed. A girl who could sense the truth. A runaway Saurian. A survivor with dangerous instincts. It didn't take long for eyes to turn toward them. Not curious eyes. Strategic ones. Governments. Syndicates. People who saw Illyra not as a person, but as a threat to be silenced or an asset to be claimed. Julian noticed the shift. He saw the growing bounty. The sudden increase in patrols. The way some stations suddenly went dark the moment they entered orbit. "You're not just someone they lost," he told her one night, quietly. "You're someone they fear." Illyra looked away. "Because I see things I'm not supposed to." "No," Julian said. "Because you see what they're trying hardest to hide." That was the difference. It wasn't that she could detect lies. It was that she could feel the intention to deceive. She could walk into a room and understand what wasn't being said, what everyone was pretending not to feel. And in a galaxy governed by politics, performance, and manipulation, that was the kind of truth no one wanted uncovered. Her existence alone disrupted the equation. She realized then that her survival wasn't just about escape. It was about resistance. Not with weapons. Not with force. But with clarity. With presence. With refusal to be silenced or hidden again. She wasn't a weapon. She wasn't a tool. She was a mirror, and people were terrified of what they might see in their reflection. Julian, for his part, never treated her like a thing to be used. When she asked him what he wanted from her, he simply said, "I want you to be free enough to decide what you want for yourself." That freedom, that autonomy, that choice, it became the core of who she was becoming. She didn't seek revenge. She didn't want chaos. She wanted to walk into a room and say the one thing no one had ever let her say before. "I see you." Because sometimes, the most dangerous person in the galaxy isn't the one with the biggest gun or the most powerful ship. Sometimes, it's the one who knows the truth and has the courage to speak it aloud. They didn't start as a team. They barely trusted each other. Julian Cross was a man who had long since stopped believing in causes. He operated in the gray, just skilled enough to stay alive, just detached enough not to care. And Illyra, though free from her cage, still moved like someone waiting to be hunted, her body always tense, her eyes always searching for the next betrayal. At first, they spoke in short, necessary words. She didn't ask questions. He didn't offer comfort. But something began to grow in the silence between them, something fragile but persistent, like a seed breaking through dry earth. They had every reason to remain strangers. Every reason to part ways the moment safety allowed it. But safety never came. And somewhere between evading bounty hunters and surviving cold outposts in forgotten systems, something shifted. They began to rely on each other, not out of desperation, but out of quiet respect. Julian learned to listen when Illyra warned of subtle shifts in tone, of the danger hidden behind pleasantries. Illyra learned to trust the way he stood in front of her, not to protect her because she was weak, but because he refused to let the world break her again. They were different in every possible way. He was rough-edged, weathered by war, fluent in the language of loss. She was soft-spoken, newly awakened to her own power, carrying a grief too old for her years. And yet, those differences didn't divide them, they grounded them. Each reminded the other of something they had nearly forgotten: they were still human, even if one of them wasn't born that way. It wasn't a grand revelation. No speech. No moment of sudden realization. It happened slowly, in gestures and looks. In the way Julian would hand her the last ration without saying a word. In the way Elora would adjust their course based on a feeling she couldn't explain, only for them to narrowly avoid an ambush she had sensed long before the scanners picked it up. Their partnership was not forged in strategy. It was built in the quiet spaces where wounds were acknowledged without being dissected. Where silence didn't mean distance, but safety. Together, they began to move differently. No longer as fugitives, but as something more deliberate. They stopped avoiding the systems that had once betrayed them. They started slipping into places where their names were still whispered, where others like Elora abandoned, hunted, silenced still waited behind shadows, unsure if survival was the same as living. It started with a message. A small beacon on a dead relay station, reactivated with Julian's hands and Elora's instincts. The message was simple: you're not alone. Then came the names. Then came the faces. Survivors. Escapees. The forgotten. The message spread, not because they shouted it, but because they were it. Julian, the former soldier who had walked away from every cause that failed him, and Elora, the girl they tried to erase together, they became living proof that defiance didn't have to be loud. It only had to be consistent. They became myth in the places where hope had died. The pilot and the girl with golden eyes. The ship that vanished through asteroid fields like smoke. The ones who didn't just survive the fire but carried its light into the dark. And with each encounter, each rescue, each quiet conversation shared in the broken corners of the galaxy, something became clear. They weren't just evading capture. They weren't just escaping. They were building something. Elora's voice, once hesitant and thin, began to carry weight. When she spoke to the scattered remnants of the Saurian, she didn't promise revenge. She offered recognition. She said the words so many of them had longed to hear: I remember you. You're still real. You still matter. Julian didn't speak as much. He let her take the lead. But when he did speak, he had a way of cutting through every pretense. He didn't tell people what they wanted to hear. He told them what was true. They weren't here to fix the galaxy. They were here because no one else had been. Because someone had to be. And that made people listen. Their presence became a spark. Others began to step forward, not with weapons, but with memory. With purpose. People who had lost everything and thought that meant they had nothing left to give. People who had once been called too strange, too broken, too dangerous to be part of something greater. They started finding one another. And when they looked to Julian and Elora, they didn't see perfection. They saw resilience. They saw two people who had no reason to believe in anyone anymore and chose to anyway. Elora still carried the scars of captivity. She still woke some nights gasping, half dreaming of chains. Julian still kept his sidearm within reach while he slept. But those things didn't define them anymore. What defined them was what they did next. They turned their survival into meaning. They turned their silence into signal. And without ever declaring themselves leaders, they became something larger than either of them had planned. Elora once asked Julian if he thought they were doing the right thing. He looked at her for a long time before answering. I don't know what right looks like anymore. But I know what wrong looks like. And I know I don't want to look away from it anymore. That was all she needed. They didn't build a rebellion. They weren't generals. They were a symbol. A symbol that no matter how deep the system buried you, no matter how completely it tried to erase you, you could still rise. You could still reach someone else. You could still matter. Together, they were more than survivors. They were the reminder that the galaxy didn't belong to the powerful, or the ruthless, or the loudest. It belonged to those who endured and refused to disappear. It began, as most things do, with a choice. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind forged under bright lights or witnessed by crowds. There was no battle cry, no blood-soaked field, no promise of victory. Just one man, standing at the edge of a decision, staring into the quiet ache of a universe that had long since stopped answering. Julian Cross was a man who knew how to walk away. He had done it 1,000 times in war zones, in friendships, in moments where staying meant watching something good fall apart. It was a skill, walking away. A shield. You learned not to look too closely. Not to listen too deeply. You told yourself the galaxy didn't need saving, and if it did, it certainly didn't need you. But that day on that ruined moon, in the stillness of a system no one remembered, he didn't walk away. He heard a voice. Faint. Cracked. Carried through static like a last breath slipping between broken wires. A voice that didn't cry out with urgency, but with resignation. A sound not meant to reach anyone. A sound not meant to be heard. And Julian, for reasons he didn't fully understand, chose to listen. It would have been easy to ignore. Logical, even. That part of space was dangerous. The remnants of old wars lingered in mines and wreckage fields. No one sent distress signals from there anymore because no one expected an answer. It wasn't a place for mercy. It was a place where stories went to die. But he turned his ship around. That was the moment everything changed. He didn't know who she was. Didn't know what she was capable of. He couldn't have predicted the consequences. The bounty. The pursuit. The fire that would be set loose in the weeks and months to come. All he knew was that someone had been left behind and he refused to be another shadow that passed her by. That choice, the choice to see her, reverberated outward. Because she wasn't just a girl in a cage. She was a survivor of a people erased from history. A spark of something powerful. A being who could feel the tremble beneath someone's voice, the lie behind their eyes, the fracture in their spirit before they even spoke. She wasn't dangerous because of what she had done, but because of what she could not be made to forget. And Julian, by stepping into that prison and breaking her chains, did more than free her body. He gave her room to remember who she was. They fled. They survived. They kept moving through systems that wanted them gone, systems that had written her people off as anomalies to be contained or erased. But in the spaces between the danger, something else was happening. They were being watched. Not just by enemies but by those waiting for proof that resistance was still possible. That someone, somewhere, still made decisions rooted in something more than fear or profit. Julian hadn't intended to become a symbol. He didn't see himself as heroic. He still carried too many failures etched across his past to believe in anything grand. But there is a quiet kind of revolution in refusing to turn away. There is power in the ordinary act of showing up for someone who has no reason to trust that you will. That power has weight. It echoes. Not immediately. Not all at once. But it travels. Illyra began to change, too. Not just because she was free, but because she had been seen. She began to speak in places where voices had gone silent. She offered not salvation, but recognition. She didn't pretend to have answers. She offered truth. And people listened. Because the galaxy didn't need another warlord or figurehead. It needed someone who remembered what compassion sounded like. One choice. That's all it took. And choices, true ones, rooted in integrity, not impulse, create ripples that move across time and space. They reshape narratives. They tear holes in systems that thought themselves impenetrable. Julian never told people what to do. He didn't give orders. He simply continued to make the same decision, over and over again, to stay. To help. To stand beside instead of in front. To listen when others talked. To believe someone like Elora didn't need saving, only space to reclaim her own story. That consistency, quiet, unwavering, became a kind of gravity. And gravity pulls things toward it. Others followed. Not many at first. A pilot with a scarred past. A mechanic who remembered the songs of the Saurian. A deserter who had once been paid to hunt people like Elora and now sought redemption without asking to be forgiven. None of them perfect. None of them looking for glory. But all of them had reached a moment where they, too, had a choice. And because Julian had made his, because he had answered a cry that was not meant to be heard, they now stood at their own crossroads, reminded that silence doesn't have to mean consent, and isolation doesn't have to be permanent. The galaxy is vast. Cold. Filled with systems that devour hope and replace it with rules. But even there, a single act of kindness is not wasted. A single choice to stand when sitting is safer. To speak when silence is expected. To stay when leaving is easier. That is how change begins. Not with armies. Not with declarations. But with one person who refuses to pretend they didn't hear someone crying out in the dark. And then another. And another. Until the silence is broken not by force, but by presence. Julian never got a medal. He didn't want one. He didn't need recognition. He only needed to know that in a galaxy that taught him apathy was the safest way to survive, he had chosen differently. He had chosen to care. And that choice echoed. Quietly. Relentlessly. Across the stars. What lingers long after the stars fade from the viewport, after the ship disappears into the black, isn't the fire of the escape or the thrill of the pursuit. It's not the explosions, the bounty notices, or the last-minute dodges through asteroid fields. What remains is far quieter. It's the echo of a question that doesn't demand to be answered, but quietly insists on being felt. What does it mean to choose compassion in a universe that teaches you to look away? This isn't just a story about survival, or rebellion, or daring escapes through forgotten systems. This is a story about two people, Julian and Elora, who should never have met, who had every reason to walk alone, but didn't. They met in a place built to erase her, a prison made not only of steel, but of silence. And where most would have passed by, Julian listened. He didn't come with a plan. He didn't come to be a savior. He simply came because something inside him refused to ignore a voice no one else heard. That one moment, a man stopping when he could have walked on, changed the course of not just her life, but his own. It was a small choice. A quiet one. And yet, it carried a weight that would ripple through countless others. Because when you choose to show up, when you choose to acknowledge another's pain instead of turning away, you send a signal. You tell the world that dignity still matters. That presence still matters. That no life is too forgotten to be worth saving. Elora didn't need Julian to rescue her. She needed someone to remind her that she had always been more than what they had done to her. She needed someone who didn't flinch at her power or try to mold her into something safe. She needed space. She needed truth. She needed time to remember how to be whole in a world that had convinced her she was not meant to exist. And Julian, he didn't need redemption. He needed purpose. He needed to remember that walking away wasn't the only way to survive. That there is strength in staying. In witnessing. In choosing, again and again, to be the kind of person who doesn't let cruelty go unchallenged just because it's easier not to care. This story is a mirror. It reflects the small moments that define us. Not the grand ones we prepare for, but the unexpected ones that catch us off guard. The decision to reach out a hand. The courage to believe someone is worth standing beside. The discipline to choose kindness not just once, but every time it costs you something. There are no capes in this story. No chosen ones. Just people. Scarred, tired, unglamorous. People who have been broken and bent, but who haven't let that stop them from rising. Illyra and Julian didn't set out to change anything. But their presence, their refusal to vanish quietly, became a kind of resistance. They reminded others who had stopped hoping, others who had been told they were too different, too late, too small that healing is possible. That trust can be rebuilt. That the world, as brutal as it often is, still holds room for those who refuse to let it harden them. And what does that mean for us? It means the smallest act can hold the greatest power. That noticing someone, hearing someone, simply being there without agenda, without performance is sometimes the most radical thing we can do. It means that empathy is not weakness. It is rebellion. It is the refusal to let indifference be the final word. It means that survival, though important, is not enough. We must ask ourselves what comes after. What kind of life we are building. What kind of presence we are offering to others. And who we are choosing to be when no one is watching. Julian could have been just another shadow. Illyra could have disappeared, nameless, like so many before her. But instead, they became something else. Not because they planned to, but because they stayed human in the quietest, truest sense of the word. This story is not fantasy. It is a challenge. A call to remember that we, too, make choices every day. We walk past cages, some visible, many not. We hear voices, some loud, some barely whispers. And we decide whether to turn toward them or away. You don't need to save the galaxy. But you can choose to see someone. You can choose to listen. You can choose to stay when it would be easier to leave. And that, in a universe built on noise and power and forgetting, is more than enough. That is how hope survives. That is how we begin again.